The early morning light filtered through the tall windows of Kensington Palace as Catherine stirred in her bed. The house felt unusually quiet, with only the distant sound of London traffic beginning to build. She had barely slept, her mind racing, with thoughts of what lay ahead. Today would be one of the most difficult days of her life as Princess of Wales. The funeral service that awaited them was not just another royal duty but a deeply personal farewell that would test every ounce of strength she and William possessed. Catherine rose slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. She had learned over the years that on days like this, when emotions threatened to overwhelm, it was important to take everything step by step. She walked to the window and gazed out at the palace gardens, where autumn leaves were beginning to turn golden brown. The sight brought back memories of happier times, family gatherings where laughter filled these same halls. Those memories felt both precious and painful now in the adjoining room. William was already awake, sitting on the edge of their bed with his head in his hands. He had been carrying the weight of responsibility heavily these past few weeks, trying to balance his roles as a grieving family member and a future king who must remain composed for the public. Catherine could see the tension in his shoulders even from across the room. She approached him quietly, placing a gentle hand on his back. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes. Words seemed inadequate for what they were, both feeling the person they were saying goodbye to today had been such an important part of their lives. Someone who had offered guidance during their most challenging moments and celebrated with them during their happiest occasions. The thought of facing a world without that presence felt almost impossible to comprehend. Catherine finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. She reminded William that they would face this day together, just as they had faced every other challenge. In their marriage, she spoke about the importance of honoring the memory of the person they were losing while also taking care of each other and their children. Her words were simple but filled with the kind of wisdom that comes from years of supporting each other through both public scrutiny and private struggles. William looked up at his wife, seeing the strength in her eyes that had drawn him to her all those years ago. Despite her own grief, she was thinking of him, of their family, of how they would navigate this difficult time together. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers in a gesture that had become second nature over their years of marriage. In that simple touch was a conversation about love, support, and the unspoken promise to be each other's anchor in the storm of grief that surrounded them. The palace staff had been moving quietly through the halls since before dawn, making final preparations for the day ahead. Everyone understood the significance of this morning and the emotional weight it carried for the royal family. Catherine and William could hear the distant sounds of activity, but their private quarters remained a sanctuary where they could process their feelings away from the demands of protocol and public expectation. Catherine moved to her dressing room, where her lady-in-waiting had carefully prepared her outfit for the funeral service. The black coat and dress had been chosen weeks ago, but seeing them now made the day feel more real, more final. She had attended many solemn occasions as a member of the royal family, but this felt different. This was personal in a way that cut through all the ceremony and tradition to touch the core of who she was as a person. Not just as a princess. That as she began to dress, Catherine thought about the conversations she had shared with the person they were mourning. There had been moments of advice about royal life, discussions about raising children in the public eye, and simple conversations about everyday concerns that any family might share. Those memories felt like treasures now, precious reminders of a relationship that had shaped her understanding of what it meant to be part of the royal family. William joined her in the dressing room, adjusting his own formal attire with the practiced ease of someone who had worn such clothing countless times. But today even the familiar routine felt heavy with meaning. They helped each other with small details, straightening a collar here, adjusting a pin there. These tiny acts of care spoke to the partnership that had sustained them through years of public service and private challenges. The children had been told about the day ahead, and arrangements had been made for their care while their parents fulfilled their public duties. Catherine and William had spent considerable time explaining the importance of the day while also ensuring that their young ones felt secure and loved. The balance between protecting their children from overwhelming grief while helping them understand the significance of loss was something they navigated with careful attention. Before leaving their private quarters, Catherine and William took a moment to look at themselves in the mirror together. They saw two people who had grown and changed through years of marriage, parenthood, and public service. They saw the lines that worry and responsibility had etched around their eyes, but also the deep connection that had only strengthened over time. They saw two people preparing to face one of life's most difficult challenges together. The sound of vehicles arriving in the palace courtyard signaled that their time for private reflection was coming to an end. Soon they would need to step into their public roles, to be the composed and dignified representatives that the occasion demanded. But first, they allowed themselves one more moment of quiet togetherness, holding each other close and drawing strength from their bond. Catherine straightened William's tie one final time, a gesture that was both practical and deeply intimate. He smoothed the strand of her hair that had escaped from her carefully arranged style. These small acts of tenderness were their way of saying everything that words could not express. They were preparing not just for a funeral service but for a public display of grief that would be watched and analyzed by millions of people around the world as they prepared to leave their sanctuary and face the world beyond their palace walls. Catherine and William understood that this day would test them in ways they had never been tested before. They knew that their composure would be challenged, that their grief would be on display, and that they would need to find strength they were not sure they possessed. But they also knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, drawing on the love and partnership that had carried them through every other challenge in their lives together. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky as they made their final preparations to leave Kensington Palace. The day that had seemed so distant when first planned was now beginning in earnest. Catherine and William stepped toward their future, hand in hand, ready to honor the memory of someone they loved while supporting each other through one of the most emotionally demanding days of their lives. The black limousine moved slowly through the streets of London as Catherine and William sat in thoughtful silence. The city seemed different today, quieter somehow, as if even the bustling capital understood the weight of what was happening. People lined the sidewalks, many holding flowers and small signs of respect. Catherine watched through the tinted windows as ordinary citizens paused their morning routines to pay their respects. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others simply stood with heads bowed. The outpouring of genuine emotion from strangers touched her deeply. William stared ahead, his jaw set in the way Catherine had learned meant he was fighting to keep his emotions in check. She could see his reflection in the window glass, noting how his eyes seemed focused on something far in the distance. His hands rested on his knees, fingers occasionally tapping in a nervous rhythm that only she would recognize. They had been married long enough that she could read his moods without words, understanding when he needed space to process and when he needed her closer. The drive to Westminster Abbey took longer than usual due to the crowds and security measures. Catherine used this extra time to center herself, practicing the breathing techniques she had learned during her most challenging moments as a royal family member. She thought about the person they were saying goodbye to today, remembering not the formal public figure that the world knew, but the private individual who had offered guidance during her early days as William's girlfriend and later as his wife. Recalled conversations held in quiet corners of royal residences, moments when protocol was set aside for genuine human connection. There had been advice about handling media attention, wisdom about balancing personal desires with public duty, and simple encouragement during times when the pressure of royal life felt overwhelming. Those private moments had helped shape Catherine into the woman and princess she had become, and losing that source of strength felt like losing a part of herself. The limousine turned onto the street leading directly to Westminster Abbey, and both Catherine and William could see the massive crowds that had gathered. Television crews from around the world had set up their equipment, creating a maze of cameras and reporters that stretched for blocks. The sight was both impressive and intimidating, a reminder that their private grief would soon become a spectacle watched by millions of people across the globe. Catherine felt her heart rate increase as they approached the Abbey entrance. She had attended many significant events here, from her own wedding to various state occasions, but today felt different. Today she would need to maintain her composure while saying goodbye to someone she loved, all while knowing that every tear, every moment of weakness, would be captured and analyzed by cameras and commentators. William reached across the seat and took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. Without looking at each other, they both squeezed gently, a silent communication that had become their way of offering support during difficult public moments. His palm was slightly damp with nervousness, but his grip was steady and strong. Catherine drew comfort from this connection, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team. The security detail surrounding the Abbey was extensive, with officers positioned at every possible vantage point. Catherine could see snipers on nearby rooftops and undercover agents scattered throughout the crowd. The level of protection was necessary but also served as a stark reminder of the high-stakes nature of this event. World leaders and members of multiple royal families would all be gathering in one place, creating both a powerful tribute and a significant security challenge. As their limousine approached the final checkpoint, Catherine caught sight of familiar faces among the crowd of officials waiting to receive them. Palace staff members who had worked with their family for years stood ready to assist, their own expressions reflecting the emotional weight of the day. These were people who had known the deceased personally, who had their own relationships and memories that would be honored through today's service. The vehicle came to a complete stop, and Catherine could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd beyond the thick windows. Photographers were already positioning themselves for the moment when she and William would emerge. She took one final deep breath, smoothing her black dress and checking that her small clutch contained the tissues she suspected she would need. Before the day was over, William's security detail opened his door first, and Catherine watched as her husband stepped into the public eye with the practiced grace of someone who had been doing this his entire life. But she could see the slight stiffness in his movements that revealed his emotional state to anyone who knew him well. He turned back toward the car, extending his hand to help her emerge, and Catherine felt grateful for this simple gesture of support and partnership. The sound of camera shutters was overwhelming as Catherine stepped onto the stone walkway leading to the Abbey entrance. The crowd's murmur grew louder, and she could hear individual voices calling out words of support and sympathy. She walked beside William with measured steps, her training in royal protocol helping her maintain proper posture and pace despite the emotional turmoil she felt inside. Palace officials guided them toward a private entrance where they could have a few moments to compose themselves before joining the other mourners. This brief respite was a blessing Catherine had not expected, a chance to transition from the public performance required during their arrival to the more intimate grief they would need to process during the actual service. The interior of Westminster Abbey felt cool and peaceful compared to the chaos outside. The ancient stones seemed to absorb sound, creating an atmosphere of reverence that helped calm Catherine's racing heart. She could see flowers arranged throughout the space, their sweet fragrance mixing with the smell of old wood and centuries of prayer. The combination created a sensory experience that felt both solemn and comforting. William removed his formal gloves and flexed his fingers, a small sign of the tension he had been carrying. Catherine noticed this gesture and moved closer to him, their shoulders touching as they stood together in the quiet antechamber. Neither spoke, but both drew strength from their physical proximity and shared understanding of what lay ahead. Through the walls, they could hear the gradual arrival of other mourners, the soft sound of conversations and footsteps as the abbey filled with people who had come to pay their respects. Catherine thought about all these individuals who had their own relationships with the person being honored today, their own memories and stories that would live on long after this formal ceremony ended. A palisade approached them quietly, indicating that it was time to take their places for the beginning of the service. Catherine and William exchanged one last look of mutual support before following the aide toward the main sanctuary. As they walked through the corridors of the abbey, Catherine felt the weight of history around her, knowing that countless other families had walked these same paths during their own times of grief and celebration. The moment was approaching when their private sorrow would become part of a public ceremony, when their personal loss would be shared with the watching world. Catherine straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of strength she hoped would carry her through the hours ahead. Beside her, William did the same, and together they prepared to honor someone they loved while the entire world watched and waited. The massive doors of Westminster Abbey opened before Catherine and William, revealing the breathtaking sight of hundreds of mourners already seated in perfect rows. The ancient building seemed to hold its breath as the royal couple made their entrance. Every pew was filled with faces both familiar and unknown, creating a sea of black clothing and solemn expressions that stretched from the front altar all the way to the back of the historic church. Catherine felt her chest tighten as she took in the overwhelming scene. She had attended many large gatherings as a member of the royal family, but something about this moment felt different. The weight of collective grief seemed to press down on everyone present, creating an atmosphere so thick with emotion that it was almost difficult to breathe. She could sense the cameras following their every movement, but for once the usual awareness of being watched felt secondary to the profound sadness that filled the sacred space. Walking down the center aisle felt like moving through a dream. Each step echoed softly against the stone floor, and Catherine became acutely aware of the sound her heels made against the ancient stones. William walked beside her with steady determination, but she could feel the slight tremor in his arm where it brushed against hers. The formal processional that they had practiced seemed to fade away, replaced by something much more raw and immediate. The front rows were reserved for family members, and Catherine could see familiar faces already seated and waiting. Some relatives dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, while others stared straight ahead with the kind of blank expression that comes from trying to process overwhelming loss. Children who had been dressed in their finest black clothing sat quietly between adults, their young faces reflecting confusion about the heavy emotion surrounding them as they approached their designated seats. Catherine caught sight of the simple wooden casket positioned at the front of the church. It was draped with flowers and the royal standard, but somehow these formal decorations could not disguise the finality of what lay beneath. The reality of their loss hit her with renewed force, and she felt her carefully maintain composure waver for just a moment. William seemed to sense her emotional struggle and moved slightly closer, his presence offering silent support. They took their seats in the front row, and Catherine was grateful for the brief moment to collect herself before the service began. She looked around at the other mourners, noting how grief had united people who might otherwise have little in common. World leaders sat beside family friends, celebrities mixed with palace staff, and everyone seemed equally affected by the solemnity of the occasion. The Archbishop of Canterbury stepped forward to begin the service, his voice carrying clearly through the abbey's excellent acoustics. As he spoke the opening words of comfort and remembrance, Catherine found herself focusing not on the formal religious language but on the genuine emotion in his tone. Even this man of great experience and wisdom seemed moved by the significance of the moment and the person they were gathered to honor. During the first hymn, Catherine and William stood with the rest of the congregation, their voices joining hundreds of others in song. The music seemed to rise and fill every corner of the ancient building, creating a sound that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. Catherine felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as the familiar words took on new meaning in the context of their loss, she glanced sideways at William and saw that he too was struggling with his emotions. His usually steady voice cracked slightly on certain notes and his hands gripped the hymn book more tightly than necessary. The sight of her husband, fighting back tears, made Catherine's own emotional control more difficult to maintain. They had always been each other's source of strength, but today they were both drowning in the same ocean of grief. The first reading came from a family member who had volunteered to share memories and stories. As the speaker approached the podium, Catherine could see the nervous energy in their movements, the way their hands shook slightly as they adjusted the microphone. The personal anecdotes and loving descriptions that followed painted a picture of someone who had lived a full and meaningful life, touching countless people along the way. Catherine found herself remembering her own interactions with the deceased, moments that had not seemed particularly significant at the time but now felt precious beyond measure. Simple conversations over tea, advice given during difficult times, celebrations shared during happy occasions. All of these memories rushed back with overwhelming intensity, and she realized that grief was not just about losing someone in the present, but about losing all the future moments that would never happen. The abbey fell completely silent during a moment of reflection, and in that quietness Catherine became aware of the collective breathing of hundreds of mourners. The sound was somehow both comforting and overwhelming, a reminder that she and William were not alone in their sorrow. Others had loved this person too. Others would carry forward memories and stories. Others would feel this absence in their daily lives. William reached for Catherine's hand during the silent reflection, their fingers intertwining with practiced ease. The simple gesture sent a wave of comfort through her, reminding her that even in the midst of profound loss, she still had this partnership that had sustained her through so many challenges. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, a tiny movement that spoke volumes about their connection and mutual support. When the moment of silence ended, Catherine noticed that many people throughout the abbey were wiping away tears. The grief that everyone had been trying to contain with proper decorum was beginning to show through the formal facade. She saw elderly relatives openly crying, young family members leaning on each other for support, and even some of the usually stoic palace staff showing signs of emotional distress. The next portion of the service included readings from various religious texts, but Catherine found her attention drifting to the stained glass windows that surrounded them. The colored light streaming through the ancient glass created patterns on the stone walls, shifting and changing as clouds moved across the sky outside. There was something eternal about these windows, something that spoke to the continuity of life and love even in the face of death. As the service continued, Catherine became increasingly aware of the camera's position throughout the abbey. She knew that millions of people around the world were watching this private moment of grief become a public ceremony. The thought was both comforting and disturbing, knowing that others shared in their sorrow but also feeling exposed in their most vulnerable moments. The Archbishop began speaking about resurrection and eternal life, themes that offered hope alongside the sadness. Catherine tried to focus on these words of comfort, but found herself distracted by the very human sounds of people crying softly throughout the congregation. The mix of formal religious ceremony and raw human emotion created a complex atmosphere that seemed to capture something essential about the human experience of loss. William's grip on her hand tightened slightly, and Catherine realized that they were approaching the most difficult part of the service. Soon they would need to say their final goodbye, to participate in rituals that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The weight of that approaching moment seemed to settle over both of them like a heavy blanket, making each breath feel more deliberate and each heartbeat more noticeable. The moment Catherine had been dreading finally arrived as the Archbishop called for the final tribute. The entire congregation fell into a profound silence that seemed to echo through every corner of Westminster Abbey. She could feel her heart beating so loudly that she wondered if William could hear it beside her. This was the part of the service where family members would have their last opportunity to say goodbye, to speak directly to the person they were losing. Even though words felt impossibly inadequate for such a monumental farewell, William was scheduled to deliver the primary family eulogy, a responsibility that had weighed heavily on him for weeks. Catherine watched as her husband slowly rose from his seat, his movements careful and deliberate. She could see the slight tremor in his hands as he adjusted his jacket, a nervous habit she had observed during their most challenging public moments. The walk from their front row seat to the ornate podium seemed to take forever, each step measured and heavy with the weight of what he was about to undertake. As William reached the podium and looked out over the sea of faces, Catherine held her breath. She knew how much this moment meant to him, how carefully he had crafted his words to honor someone who had been such an important part of their lives, but she also knew how difficult it would be for him to maintain his composure while sharing such personal memories in front of hundreds of mourners and millions of television viewers around the world. William began speaking in a voice that was steady but noticeably deeper than usual, a sign that he was fighting to control his emotions. His words painted a picture of someone who had been not just a public figure but a beloved family member, someone who had offered guidance during difficult times and shared in celebrations during happy moments. Catherine found herself nodding, slightly as he spoke, recognizing the stories and memories that had become part of their family's shared history. Halfway through the eulogy, William's voice began to crack. Catherine could see him pause, taking a deep breath as he gripped the edges of the podium more tightly. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds, and she found herself willing him to continue, sending him all the strength she could through their invisible connection. When he resumed speaking, his voice was softer but somehow more powerful, filled with the kind of raw emotion that made everyone in the abbey lean forward to hear every word. Catherine felt tears beginning to flow down her cheeks as William shared a particularly touching memory about family gatherings and private conversations. These were moments that the public had never seen, intimate glimpses into the person behind the formal titles and official duties. Hearing these stories shared aloud made their loss feel both more real and more profound, transforming private grief into something that everyone present could understand and share. The cameras positioned throughout the abbey captured every moment of William's emotional tribute, but Catherine noticed that even the photographers seemed to be affected by what they were witnessing. Some had lowered their cameras entirely, caught up in the human drama unfolding before them. Others continued shooting, but with a reverence that suggested they understood they were documenting something truly significant and deeply personal. When William reached the final paragraph of his eulogy, his voice broke completely. Catherine could see him struggling to continue, his shoulders shaking slightly as he fought back tears. The entire congregation seemed to hold its breath, willing him to find the strength to finish what he had started. In that moment of vulnerability, the future king became simply a grieving family member, someone dealing with loss in the most human way possible. Catherine felt an overwhelming urge to go to him, to offer the physical comfort and support that had sustained them both through so many challenges. But protocol and the formal nature of the service kept her in her seat, forcing her to offer her strength from a distance. She placed her hand over her heart, a gesture that William had told her he could always feel even when they were apart, and hoped that somehow her love and support would reach him at the podium. With tremendous effort, William managed to complete his eulogy, his final words spoken in barely more than a whisper but carrying clearly through the abbey's acoustics. As he stepped away from the podium, Catherine could see the relief and exhaustion in his posture. He had accomplished something incredibly difficult, sharing his grief and love with the world while maintaining the dignity that his position required. The congregation responded to William's eulogy with complete silence, a tribute more powerful than any applause could have been. Catherine could see people throughout the abbey wiping away tears, their own emotions stirred by the raw honesty of what they had just witnessed. Even the most formal dignitaries and world leaders seemed moved by the display of genuine human feeling. As William made his way back to his seat, Catherine could see that he was barely holding himself together. The effort of delivering such a personal tribute in such a public setting had clearly taken everything he had. She reached for his hand the moment he sat down, intertwining their fingers and squeezing gently to let him know how proud she was of his courage and strength. The service continued with additional readings and musical selections, but Catherine found it difficult to focus on anything other than her husband's emotional state. She could feel him trembling slightly beside her, the after effects of the tremendous effort he had just made. His breathing was careful and controlled, the way it got when he was trying to regain his composure after a particularly challenging moment. During the next hymn, Catherine noticed that William's voice was completely gone, his throat too tight with emotion to produce any sound. She moved closer to him, their shoulders touching as they stood with the rest of the congregation. This small physical connection seemed to help stabilize him, and she could feel some of the tension leaving his body as he drew strength from her presence. The Archbishop began the final prayers of the service, and Catherine realized that their time for formal goodbye was nearly over. Soon they would need to process out of the abbey, to face the crowds and cameras waiting outside, to begin the difficult journey of learning to live with their loss. The thought was both overwhelming and somehow comforting, knowing that the most difficult part of the day was almost behind them as the service moved toward its conclusion. Catherine found herself thinking about the person they were honoring, about all the ways this individual had shaped their lives and their understanding of duty, service, and family. The grief was still overwhelming, but alongside it was a deep gratitude for having had such an important presence in their lives. Even though that presence was now only a memory, the final blessing began, and Catherine could feel the collective emotion of everyone in the abbey reaching a crescendo. This was the moment when their private grief would officially become public mourning, when the formal ceremonies would give way to the long process of healing and remembrance. She squeezed William's hand one more time, drawing strength from their partnership as they prepared to face whatever came next. The sound of the congregation rising for the final hymn filled the ancient building, hundreds of voices joining together in a song of farewell that seemed to lift toward the vaulted ceiling and beyond. The final hymn echoed through Westminster Abbey as Catherine and William prepared for the most emotionally charged moment of the entire service. The processional that would follow the casket out of the ancient church represented their last formal goodbye, the final chapter of a relationship that had shaped both of their lives in countless ways. Catherine could feel her legs trembling slightly as she stood, knowing that in just moments they would need to walk behind the flower-covered casket while maintaining their composure in front of the watching world. William took her arm gently as they prepared to join the processional line. His touch was steady despite everything he had been through during his emotional eulogy, and Catherine drew strength from his ability to support her even while dealing with his own overwhelming grief. They had become experts at this kind of mutual care over their years of marriage, learning to be strong for each other when individual strength felt impossible to find. The casket began its slow journey down the center aisle of the abbey. Carried by military pallbearers who moved with precision and reverence, Catherine watched the simple wooden box pass by their row, and the reality of what was happening hit her with renewed force. This was truly the end, the final moment when they would be in the same space as someone who had been such an important part of their family. The finality of it felt almost impossible to accept. As they stepped into the processional line behind other family members, Catherine became aware of the hundreds of mourners rising from their seats throughout the abbey. The sound of rustling clothing and shifting bodies created a gentle background noise that somehow made the moment feel more human and less like a formal ceremony. She could see people in the congregation wiping away tears, their own emotions stirred by the sight of the grieving family. The walk down the aisle seemed to take forever, each step measured and careful. Catherine found herself looking at the faces of the mourners they passed, seeing her own grief reflected in the eyes of strangers who had also been touched by the life they were celebrating. There were elderly people who had known the deceased for decades, younger faces who represented the next generation, and children who might not fully understand what was happening but sensed the importance of the moment. Halfway down the aisle, Catherine felt William's grip on her arm tighten slightly. She glanced at him and saw that he was looking straight ahead with intense concentration, using every ounce of his training and willpower to maintain his composure. The effort was clearly costing him tremendously, and she could see the muscles in his jaw working as he fought to keep his emotions under control. The television cameras followed their every step, capturing angles and expressions that would be analyzed and discussed for years to come. But Catherine found that her usual awareness of being filmed had faded into the background, overwhelmed by the much more immediate reality of saying goodbye to someone she loved. The public nature of their grief felt almost secondary to the personal pain they were experiencing. That as they neared the exit of the abbey, Catherine could hear the sound of the crowds waiting outside. The murmur of thousands of people created a low background noise that grew louder as they approached the massive doors. She knew that stepping outside would mean facing a wall of cameras and spectators, transforming their private moment of grief into a very public display of loss and mourning. The casket passed through the abbey doors and into the bright afternoon sunlight, and Catherine felt momentarily blinded by the sudden change from the dim interior of the church. The sound of the crowd grew dramatically louder, with people calling out words of support and sympathy. Camera shutters clicked constantly, creating a sound like rainfall that seemed to come from every direction. William and Catherine emerged from the abbey together, and Catherine was struck by how different the world looked after the intensity of the service. The ordinary London street scene felt surreal after the sacred atmosphere inside the church. People lined the sidewalks for blocks in every direction, many holding flowers or small signs of respect. The outpouring of public support was both comforting and overwhelming. They continued to follow the casket toward the waiting hearse, their steps carefully measured to match the solemn pace of the procession. Catherine could feel the weight of thousands of eyes upon them, but she also sensed the genuine sympathy and support from the crowd. Many people were crying openly, their own emotions stirred by witnessing such a personal moment of loss. As they reached the hearse, Catherine realized that this was truly the final moment of their formal goodbye. Soon the casket would be loaded into the vehicle and driven away, beginning its journey to the final resting place. The thought of watching that car drive away felt almost unbearable, knowing that it represented the end of a physical presence that had been part of their lives for so many years. The pallbearers carefully loaded the casket into the hearse with military precision, their movements respectful and deliberate. Catherine watched every detail of this process, knowing that these were the last moments she would ever spend in the same space as someone who had meant so much to her family. The flowers on top of the casket shifted slightly as it was secured in place, a small movement that somehow made the moment feel more real and more final. William placed his hand on Catherine's back as they stood watching the hearse being prepared for departure. His touch was gentle but firm, offering support while also drawing strength from their connection. Neither of them spoke, but their shared silence communicated everything that words could not express about their grief, their love, and their commitment to supporting each other through this difficult time. The hearse began to move slowly away from Westminster Abbey, and Catherine felt something inside her break as she watched it disappear into London traffic. The person they had been honoring was truly gone now, leaving behind only memories and the impact they had made on countless lives. The finality of that moment hit both Catherine and William with overwhelming force as the official procession began to disperse. Catherine and William found themselves surrounded by other family members who were also struggling with their emotions. There were quiet embraces, whispered words of comfort, and the kind of mutual support that emerges naturally during times of profound loss. Even in their grief, they were not alone. The crowd began to thin as people started to leave the area around Westminster Abbey, but many remained to offer their continued support to the royal family. Catherine could see flowers being placed along the barriers, creating an impromptu memorial that spoke to the impact the deceased had made on ordinary people. The sight was both beautiful and heartbreaking. William and Catherine slowly made their way back toward their waiting car, both emotionally drained from the intensity of the service and the public nature of their grief. They had accomplished what they set out to do, honoring someone they loved while maintaining the dignity that their positions required. But the cost had been enormous, leaving them both feeling raw and vulnerable as they settled into their car. For the journey back to Kensington Palace, Catherine and William finally allowed themselves to fully feel the weight of what they had just experienced. They had said goodbye to someone irreplaceable, someone whose absence would be felt in countless ways for years to come. But they had also demonstrated the strength of their partnership and their ability to support each other through even the most challenging circumstances life could present.